In the sterile halls of Manhattan's most exclusive medical center, a powerful man's world shatters when DNA results challenge everything he believed about his inability to have children. As twin babies' cries echo through hospital corridors, a story of destiny, denial, and unexpected bonds unfolds. Behind closed doors of the city's elite, medical records reveal a truth that will forever change the dynamics of power and privilege. What starts as a simple paternity test evolves into a tale that questions the very nature of family and inheritance. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of newborn cries echoing from the nursery down the hall. Julian Thorne, a man sculpted from ambition and control, stood rigid in his tailored suit, the crisp fabric a shield against the tremor in his hands. The DNA results lay in his hand, a stark, undeniable truth printed in clinical black and white. Twins. His twins. Serafina, his wife, perched on a nearby chair, her elegant posture betraying the turmoil within. Her silence was a sharp blade, cutting deeper than any accusation. The soft glow of the hallway lights highlighted the subtle lines of worry etched around her eyes, usually masked by expertly applied makeup. "Impossible," Julian breathed, his voice a strained whisper. The carefully constructed walls of his life, built on years of calculated success and a carefully maintained distance, crumbled before the weight of this impossible reality. He had been told definitively he was infertile, a past medical condition, a cruel twist of fate that had shaped his entire existence. Serafina finally spoke, her voice a low, controlled murmur. Perhaps there was a mistake. The words lacked conviction, a desperate attempt to cling to the familiar landscape of their controlled life. The fear in her eyes, however, was palpable. It wasn't the fear of a medical error. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite articulate. Julian's gaze fell on the results again. The starkness of the print mirrored the emptiness he felt inside, a void only now beginning to be filled by an overwhelming surge of emotions, disbelief, fear, and a strange, nascent hope. The carefully constructed facade of his meticulously controlled life was crumbling, revealing the raw, vulnerable man beneath. The twins' cries, once distant echoes, now felt like a poignant counterpoint to his silent turmoil. His sterile world, once a source of pride and power, now felt like a cage. The scent of antiseptic, once comforting, now suffocated him. He needed air, needed answers. He needed to understand. The sterile white of the hospital hallway seemed to amplify the tremor in Julian's hands. He reread the results, the stark black print blurring through his unshed tears. Serafina's silence pressed down on him, heavier than any accusation. He saw the fear behind her carefully composed facade, a fear that mirrored his own, yet felt profoundly different. His was the fear of the unknown, of a world turned upside down. Hers a deeper, more chilling dread. He looked at her, truly saw her, for the first time in years. The sculpted elegance, the flawless makeup, couldn't quite mask the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the subtle trembling of her hands. "A mistake," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper, the words devoid of the usual icy control. He wanted to believe her. He desperately needed to believe there was a simple, easily rectified error. But the undeniable truth of the DNA report, the echoing cries from the nursery, they were impossible to ignore. His meticulously crafted life, built on calculated risks and unwavering self-control, had been shattered by the undeniable fact of his paternity. The cool air conditioning felt like a physical blow against his burning cheeks. The scent of antiseptic, usually a reassuring marker of order and control, now felt suffocating. He needed to breathe, to escape the sterile confines of this hall, to unravel the mystery of his supposed infertility. He walked towards the nursery, drawn by the insistent cries of his twins, an instinctual pull stronger than his carefully cultivated rational mind. He could feel the weight of his secret, his carefully guarded past, pressing down. This wasn't just a medical anomaly. It hinted at a deliberate deception, a conspiracy that stretched far beyond the walls of this exclusive hospital. And Serafina, his seemingly impassive wife, was inextricably tangled in it all. The faint sound of the twins' cries transformed into a poignant symphony, a desperate plea for understanding. The world he knew was crumbling, and in its place, a new, terrifying, and yet thrillingly hopeful reality was emerging. The nursery was a haven of pastel pinks and blues, a stark contrast to the sterile hallway outside. Julian hesitated at the threshold, the scent of baby powder and something faintly milky filling his nostrils. Two tiny forms, nestled in separate cribs, stirred. One, a girl, gurgled, her tiny hand reaching out. The other, a boy, let out a wail, his face scrunching up in a miniature frown. He approached slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs, a rhythm that echoed the twins' cries. He'd always considered himself a man of control, a master of his own destiny. Yet here he was, overwhelmed by a primal instinct he hadn't known existed. He reached out, his finger brushing against the girl's soft cheek. Her skin felt unbelievably delicate, impossibly warm against his. They're beautiful, he whispered, the words catching in his throat. The raw emotion surprised him, the unexpected vulnerability a stark departure from his usual composed exterior. Serafina entered, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of something akin to fear? Or was it something else entirely? Resentment? "Julian," she said, her voice tight, "we need to talk. This can't continue." The casual cruelty of her words sliced through him. He glanced back at the twins, their tiny faces oblivious to the storm brewing around them. "Can't continue?" he echoed, his voice laced with disbelief. "They're my children, Serafina. My children." "Don't be foolish," she retorted, her voice sharper now. This changes everything. Our lives." She turned, her shoulders rigid, her back to him as she spoke. "It changes everything." The unspoken words hung in the air, heavier than the scent of baby powder. Power, status, their meticulously constructed world. A world now undeniably threatened by these tiny, innocent beings. The nursery, once a haven of pastel calm, suddenly felt claustrophobic, the air thick with unspoken accusations and a rising tide of fear. The sterile white of the hospital room seemed to amplify the silence, a silence broken only by the twins' intermittent coos and gurgles. Julian watched them, mesmerized. The girl, with Serafina's dark hair and his own piercing blue eyes, slept soundly, a tiny hand curled around a worn, knitted rabbit. The boy, a mirror image of his father, fussed, his lips pursed in a miniature pout. He reached out a tentative finger, touching the boy's soft cheek. The skin was surprisingly warm, a stark contrast to the clinical coldness of the room. A wave of protectiveness washed over him, an unfamiliar emotion both terrifying and exhilarating. It was a feeling completely foreign to the carefully constructed, emotionally guarded Julian he'd always known. This raw, overwhelming love surprised him. It was a vulnerability he'd meticulously avoided for years, a chasm he'd built walls around. Now those walls crumbled before the sight of these two tiny humans, undeniably his. "They're perfect," he whispered, the words a breathy acknowledgement of the truth that threatened to dismantle everything. Serafina remained standing by the window, her back to him, her silhouette a stark contrast against the city lights twinkling far below. The city that represented her ambition, her power, the world she and Julian had meticulously crafted. A world now threatened by the existence of these innocent, vulnerable babies. "Don't get attached," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, still tight with a chilling detachment. The words hung in the air, sharp and cold, like shards of ice. Julian turned, his heart heavy. Her response, or rather, her lack of maternal warmth, pierced him more deeply than any blade. He'd expected shock, perhaps even anger, but this cold dismissal, this was far worse. It fueled a burgeoning fear. Was this how she truly felt? Had she been merely tolerating him, her participation in their marriage nothing more than a calculated move for power and security? Attached? He echoed, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. They're my sons, Serafina, my flesh and blood. She finally turned, her face devoid of any emotion he could decipher. Her eyes, usually sparkling with ambition, now held a chilling emptiness. This changes everything, Julian, she repeated, her voice flat, devoid of warmth. Our lives. Everything. The unspoken words hung heavier than the sterile air. Inheritance, power, his carefully constructed empire. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating the nascent joy he felt at the presence of his children. The fear that had been a seed of doubt was now a fast-growing vine, strangling the love he'd just begun to discover. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Julian's clothes, a stark contrast to the earthy sweetness of the twins' downy heads nestled against his chest. He held them, one in each arm, their tiny breaths a rhythm against his skin. The weight of them, so slight, yet so immense, anchored him. Outside, the city roared, a symphony of sirens and car horns. But here, in this quiet room, there was only the soft susurrus of their breaths and the frantic thump of his own heart. Serafina stood by the window, her reflection a ghost in the glass, the city lights painting her face in shades of cold indifference. The view was breathtaking, a panoramic vista of glittering skyscrapers, but it reflected nothing of the turmoil within her. Julian shifted, attempting to settle the restless boy, a miniature version of himself, with his father's sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes. They're beautiful, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion, the words a fragile shield against the rising tide of fear. Serafina finally turned, her gaze distant, unreadable. Beautiful, she repeated, the word hollow, devoid of warmth, but inconvenient. The chill in her voice was a physical thing, a cold breeze cutting through the already frigid air of the hospital room. The knitted rabbit slipped from the girl's grasp, a small, soft thud on the crisp white sheets. Julian felt a pang of something akin to despair. This wasn't the shock, the anger, or even the denial he'd anticipated. This icy detachment, this calculated indifference. It shattered him more profoundly than any outright rejection. He looked down at the twins, their innocence a stark contrast to the bitter reality settling around him. His carefully constructed world, built on power, control, and the unwavering belief in his infertility, lay in ruins. Inconvenient, he echoed, his voice barely above a whisper. They're my sons. The words felt both fragile and defiant, a testament to the love already burgeoning within him, a love that was terrifying in its intensity and completely unexpected. He looked up at Serafina, seeking an ounce of understanding, of shared emotion, but found only the impenetrable wall of her composure, her ambition hardening her gaze into something unforgiving. This changes everything, she stated flatly, her voice devoid of any trace of affection. The Thorne legacy. Everything. Her focus remained unwavering. Everything centered on power and the future he'd meticulously planned, a plan now irrevocably altered by the existence of these two tiny beings. The legacy, the power, the empire he'd painstakingly built, now threatened by these innocent lives. He held his sons closer, shielding them from the chilling realization dawning on him. He was facing a battle far greater than any business deal. This was a fight for his family, for the very essence of what he believed he understood about himself, about his life. The sterile white of the hospital room seemed to amplify the silence, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony of Julian's thoughts. He watched Serafina, her profile sharp against the panoramic city view, a glacial queen surveying her kingdom. The knitted rabbit lay discarded on the pristine sheets, a small, fallen symbol of innocence lost in the storm of their discord. He shifted the twins again, their soft weight a comforting anchor against the rising tide of his anxiety. Their tiny fingers, so perfectly formed, curled around his. A wave of tenderness, so unexpected and overwhelming, washed over him. It was a raw, primal feeling, a love so profound it both terrified and exhilarated him. They're perfect, he whispered, the words catching in his throat, the emotion thick, almost suffocating. Serafina didn't turn. Her silence was a wall, impenetrable and cold. The city lights reflected in her eyes, but there was no warmth, only a chilling calculation. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic rise and fall of the babies' chests. Julian broke the silence, his voice strained. "Serafina, we need to talk." She finally turned, her gaze piercing, assessing. "There's nothing to talk about, Julian. The results are conclusive. But this changes everything," he stammered, searching for the right words, the right tone, anything to pierce through the icy barrier she'd erected. This is my family." His voice cracked, betraying the tremor of fear and uncertainty that ran through him. He felt exposed, vulnerable, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. "Family?" she echoed, her voice laced with bitter irony. "This complicates things immensely. The Thorne legacy, my position." Her words were clipped, precise, devoid of any emotional warmth. The babies, their innocent slumber, seemed to be an inconvenience, an obstacle in her grand design. The weight of her words hit him like a physical blow. He had built his empire on control, on precision, on a carefully constructed life. Now, this unexpected reality threatened to unravel everything. The twins, his sons, were not just a disruption. They were a seismic shift in the tectonic plates of his meticulously planned future. The fear, raw and potent, was a tangible thing, constricting his chest, making it difficult to breathe. He clung to the twins, their small bodies a shield against the overwhelming uncertainty that threatened to consume him. The fight for his family, for these innocent lives, was just beginning. The fluorescent lights hummed a sterile lullaby above them, a counterpoint to the twins' soft sighs. Julian cradled them, their weight surprisingly comforting against the turmoil raging within him. The scent of baby powder and antiseptic filled the air, a strange, unsettling perfume clinging to this moment of profound upheaval. He glanced at Serafina, her back ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on the cityscape outside. The city lights, a million glittering jewels scattered across the black velvet night, seemed to mock the darkness closing in on them. "Serafina," he began, his voice a fragile thread against the silence. "We need to talk about this. About them." He gestured to the sleeping infants nestled in his arms, their tiny breaths puffing against his chest. Serafina didn't turn. "There's nothing to talk about, Julian. The results are irrefutable." Her voice was cold, detached, as if discussing a business transaction rather than the seismic shift occurring in their lives. The casual cruelty of it sliced through him, sharp and precise. He felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach, a tightening he'd known since the doctor first delivered the devastating infertility diagnosis years ago. That diagnosis, now shattered into a million pieces by the undeniable presence of these two perfect beings. He felt a tremor of something new, something powerful. Primal fear mixed with a fierce protective instinct. "But they're my sons," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. The fear, raw and potent, threatened to overwhelm him. This wasn't just about a shattered life plan. It was about the sudden, overwhelming reality of fatherhood, a reality that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Serafina finally turned, her eyes like chips of ice. "This complicates everything, Julian. The Thorne legacy, my position." Her words were precise, surgically efficient, devoid of any warmth or empathy. The unspoken threat hung heavy in the air, a chilling reminder of the power dynamics that governed their marriage. The sterile hospital room, meant to be a sanctuary of healing, felt instead like a cold, unforgiving battlefield. He felt a tremor of anger rise within him, a burning resentment against the coldness that radiated from her. He looked again at the twins, their innocent faces a stark contrast to the bitter battleground unfolding around them. This fight, he realized, was only just beginning. The fight for his family, for his sons, and perhaps, for the soul of his own carefully constructed world. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Julian's clothes, a stark contrast to the sweet, milky smell emanating from the twins nestled in his arms. He shifted them gently, their tiny bodies warm against his chest, a weight both comforting and terrifying. Outside, the Manhattan skyline glittered, a cold, indifferent beauty mirroring the icy distance in Serafina's eyes. Irrefutable, she repeated, her voice a brittle whisper that sliced through the silence. The word hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the fear masked by a brittle facade of control. Fear and something else, resentment. A deep, bitter resentment that chilled him more than the hospital's air conditioning. He felt a tremor of anger, a hot, unexpected burn in his chest. This wasn't just about the DNA results. It was about years of carefully constructed lies, of a life built on a foundation of sand. He'd spent his life mastering the art of control, of projecting an image of unshakable power. Yet here he was undone by two tiny human beings. "This changes everything," he said, his voice rough, the words barely a murmur against the rhythmic whoosh of the heart monitor beside the crib. He wasn't just speaking to Serafina. He was speaking to himself, acknowledging the seismic shift in his carefully ordered world. Serafina's lips tightened. The city lights, reflected in her cold, dark eyes, seemed to amplify the icy distance between them. "Everything?" she echoed, the question laced with a bitterness that resonated with the hum of the fluorescent lights above. "My position, Julian. The Thorne legacy." Her words, precise and cutting, revealed the depth of her anxieties, the fear of losing the power and privilege they'd both so meticulously cultivated. He looked down at the sleeping infants, their delicate breaths a fragile counterpoint to the storm brewing between him and his wife. He saw not just his sons, but the future he'd never envisioned, a future that terrified him yet simultaneously filled him with a strange, powerful hope. This fight, he knew, was just the beginning. But this time he wasn't fighting alone. He had them, his sons. And that, he realized, changed everything. The hushed reverence of the hospital archives felt suffocating. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight slicing through the gloom, illuminating the brittle pages of Julian's medical file. He ran a trembling finger along the faded ink, each word a tiny hammer blow against the carefully constructed edifice of his life. The doctor's scrawling script, once a death sentence to his dreams of fatherhood, now felt like a deliberate lie. "Impossible," he whispered, the word catching in his throat. The air tasted metallic, the scent of old paper and disinfectant clinging to the back of his throat. He slammed the file shut, the sharp sound echoing in the cavernous room. He needed answers, and Dr. Albright, the man who had delivered the original diagnosis, was the only one who could provide them. The meeting was tense, a silent battle waged in the sterile confines of Albright's office. The doctor, a man etched with the weariness of years spent battling life and death, looked older, smaller than Julian remembered. His eyes, however, held a flicker of something akin to fear. "Dr. Albright," Julian began, his voice controlled, "I need to understand the diagnosis, the complete picture." His knuckles were white, gripping the arms of the chair. Albright shuffled papers, his gaze darting away from Julian's unwavering stare. "Mr. Thorne, the tests were conclusive. There was no possibility." "Conclusive," Julian interrupted, his voice rising. "My sons are living proof that your conclusive tests were wrong. Tell me what happened." The icy control he usually cultivated began to crack, revealing the raw, desperate anxiety underneath. Albright hesitated, then sighed, the sound heavy with unspoken regret. "There were irregularities, some discrepancies in the lab results. A clerical error, perhaps." He avoided Julian's eyes, his words vague, unconvincing. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. Julian felt a cold dread creeping into his heart, a certainty that this clerical error was far more sinister than a simple mistake. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the truth was buried deep, and he was determined to unearth it, no matter the cost. The twins' cries, echoing faintly from his memory, fueled his resolve. This wasn't just about his shattered world. It was about their future, a future he was suddenly fiercely determined to protect. The faint scent of antiseptic suddenly felt less sterile, less clinical, and more like a battlefield. The car ride home was a suffocating silence, broken only by the rhythmic thump of tires on the slick city streets. Rain lashed against the windows, mirroring the storm raging inside Julian. He stole glances at the twins, nestled in their car seats, their tiny fists clenched, oblivious to the upheaval their existence had caused. The scent of baby powder and wet asphalt filled the air, a strange, unsettling combination. Serafina sat rigidly beside him, her face a mask of icy composure. The diamonds on her fingers glittered, cold and unyielding, like her heart. He reached out, his hand hovering over her arm, then retreated. The gesture felt clumsy, awkward, like a stranger's attempt at intimacy. "Serafina," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to talk." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the blurred lights of the city. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, filled with unspoken accusations and resentments. The rain intensified, drumming a frantic rhythm against the glass. He felt a wave of despair wash over him. The carefully constructed walls of his life were crumbling, brick by brick. He pulled into the driveway of their sleek, minimalist mansion, the imposing structure a stark contrast to the chaotic emotions swirling within him. As he switched off the engine, a sudden, piercing cry from one of the twins shattered the tense quiet. Julian's heart clenched. He reached for the baby, the small body soft and warm against his chest. The infant's cries subsided, replaced by a contented sigh as Julian gently rocked him. For a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift. This tiny being, his son, was undeniably his. This was real, tangible, unlike the carefully constructed facade of his previous life. Serafina watched him, her expression unreadable. He saw a flicker of something, perhaps envy, perhaps longing in her eyes before she turned away, her gaze distant, lost in her own storm of emotions. The hospital, Dr. Albright, the falsified reports, all of it seemed insignificant compared to the raw, powerful emotion he felt holding his child. The future stretched before him, daunting yet filled with a nascent hope, a hope that mirrored the fragile cries of his twins. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a profound sense of purpose, a reason to battle the darkness he had uncovered. The sterile white of Dr. Albright's office felt like a tomb. Julian sat opposite the man, the scent of antiseptic clinging to the air, a stark contrast to the lingering smell of baby powder on his clothes. Albright, his face etched with a mixture of guilt and defiance, shuffled papers nervously. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock, each tick a hammer blow against Julian's composure. "So," Julian began, his voice low and controlled, a stark contrast to the turmoil churning within him. "You admit to falsifying my medical records?" Albright cleared his throat, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. "There was a misunderstanding, clerical error perhaps, stressful times back then." "A clerical error that rendered me infertile for 20 years? Julian's voice edged with barely controlled fury. He could feel the blood rush to his face, his hands clenching into fists. The faint tremor in his voice betrayed his carefully constructed facade. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping harshly against the polished floor. "My life, my marriage, everything built on a lie." He paced the small office, the polished floor gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. The image of the twins, their tiny faces, their innocent cries, flashed before his eyes. The thought of those lost years, the years he believed himself incapable of fatherhood, fueled his rage. Albright remained seated, his posture shrinking beneath Julian's intensity. "It wasn't intentional, Mr. Thorne. There were pressures." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Influential patients, high-profile cases." He trailed off, the unspoken implication hanging heavy in the air. Julian stopped pacing, his back to the doctor. He stared out the window, the city sprawling below him, a concrete jungle indifferent to his turmoil. A single tear traced a path down his cheek, unnoticed, swallowed by the stiff collar of his shirt. Pressures, Julian repeated, his voice a barely audible whisper. He turned back to face Albright, his eyes blazing. You jeopardized my life, doctor. My happiness. The words were laced with grief, a grief that resonated far beyond the immediate loss. This wasn't merely about the infertility. It was about the lost years of potential, the missed chance for connection, the suppressed yearning for a family he'd unknowingly denied himself. He felt the weight of years of suppressed emotions threatening to consume him. His carefully constructed armor of control was finally beginning to crack. The air in the hospital archives hung thick with the scent of aging paper and dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight filtering through grimy windows. Julian ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the fluorescent lights reflecting harshly off his tired eyes. He clutched a faded file, its brittle pages whispering secrets of a past he'd long buried. The rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his fingers against the worn cover punctuated the silence, a frantic counterpoint to the calm chaos of his mind. This is impossible, he murmured, his voice a low rasp. The file detailed a series of seemingly minor discrepancies in his medical records, each a tiny crack in the foundation of his life. Each discrepancy pointed towards a deliberate cover-up, a carefully constructed lie. He slammed the file shut, the sound echoing in the deserted room. The weight of the past pressed down on him, a suffocating blanket of doubt and betrayal. 20 years. 20 years of believing himself incapable of fatherhood, of living a life devoid of the warmth of a family. I want to be a part of their lives, he said, his gaze meeting hers. The intensity of his gaze, the vulnerability in his eyes, pierced through her carefully built defenses. She saw a man stripped bare, revealing a longing she'd never acknowledged, a yearning for connection that mirrored her own suppressed desires. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The city lights cast long shadows across the room, painting the scene in shades of gray and uncertainty. A single tear escaped Serafina's eye, tracing a path down her cheek, a silent acknowledgement of the years of unspoken needs, of carefully constructed barriers that now seemed insignificant against the overwhelming reality of their situation. The twins, innocent players in this drama of wealth, power, and hidden truths, slept soundly, oblivious to the tempest raging around them. The weight of the past, the fear of the future, and the potential for a new beginning hung in the balance, suspended between two souls grappling with the shattering of their carefully constructed worlds. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to Serafina's silk robe as she stared out at the Manhattan skyline, a million glittering pinpricks of light mocking her internal darkness. Julian's words echoed in her mind. I want to be a part of their lives. The statement, simple yet profound, shattered the carefully constructed walls she'd erected around her heart. Fear, raw and visceral, clawed at her. Fear of losing control, of losing Julian, of the life she'd so meticulously built. She turned, the faint rustling of silk a counterpoint to the silence in the room. The twins slept, tiny bundles of pink and white, their breaths soft as feathers against her skin. They were a mirror to her own conflicted emotions, fragile beauty juxtaposed with the potential for destruction. She picked up a tiny hand, its grasp surprisingly strong, and a wave of unexpected tenderness washed over her. He's different now, she murmured, more to herself than to the sleeping infants. The Julian who stood before her, eyes filled with a vulnerability she'd never witnessed, was a stranger, yet somehow more familiar than the cold, calculating man she'd married. He'd always been distant, but the distance was different now. It was a vulnerability, a need for connection she'd unconsciously rejected. A memory surfaced. Julian, younger, haunted, the shadow of his estranged father looming large. The sterile environment of the clinic, the doctor's cold pronouncements of infertility. All of it came back to her with terrifying clarity. The doctor's words weren't just a medical fact. They had been a shield, a justification for her own emotional detachment. She walked to the window, the cool glass a stark contrast to the warmth of the tiny hand still clutched in hers. The city lights shimmered, a vibrant tapestry woven from ambition and aspiration, dreams and disappointments. Her dreams, too, were woven into that cityscape, a life of power and influence, a life that Julian's revelation threatened to unravel. But in the grip of his hand, in the fragile presence of her twins, she saw a life of a different sort, one of love and unexpected connection, and a future she never dared to dream before. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but now, alongside it, a tentative hope began to bloom. The question lingered, though. Could she reconcile her ambition with the raw, unexpected demands of love? The fluorescent lights of the interrogation room hummed, a counterpoint to the rhythmic thump of Julian's heart. Dr. Albright, his face a mask of carefully controlled composure, sat opposite him, the scent of expensive cologne barely masking the underlying tension. "You accused me of malpractice," Albright said, his voice smooth but edged with steel. Julian's anger flared, a hot, searing burn in his chest. "Malpractice is an understatement. You destroyed my life, doctor. You stole my future." He slammed a hand on the table, the papers detailing the falsified records scattering. The sharp crack echoed in the sterile room. Albright didn't flinch. "Mr. Thorne, I assure you, there was no malice. A simple error, easily rectified. A simple error that cost me years." Julian spat, his voice thick with barely contained rage. The taste of bitterness filled his mouth. He saw the twins in his mind's eye, their tiny hands grasping his finger, their innocent eyes mirroring a trust he'd never felt capable of deserving. This was for them. This was for the life he'd been robbed of. The doctor's calm facade finally cracked, a flicker of something akin to fear crossing his features. "There were pressures," he mumbled, his gaze drifting to the window, the cityscape a hazy blur beyond the glass. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the hum of the lights and the erratic beat of Julian's heart. "Pressures," Julian pressed, leaning forward, his voice a low growl. "From whom?" Albright remained silent, his silence a confession. Julian knew, with a chilling certainty, that the conspiracy ran far deeper than a single negligent doctor. His fight had only just begun. The weight of the truth, heavy as a tombstone, settled upon him. But beneath the anger, a fragile hope bloomed, the hope for justice, for healing, and for a future where the echoes of the past couldn't silence the cries of his twins. The interrogation room felt colder now, the fluorescent hum a mocking soundtrack to Julian's simmering fury. He watched Albright, the carefully constructed composure crumbling, replaced by a tremor in his hands. The scent of expensive cologne had faded, replaced by the metallic tang of fear. "Pressures," Julian repeated, the word a sharp blade. "From whom, doctor?" Albright's eyes darted nervously. He swallowed hard, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. He looked older, the years of carefully cultivated success suddenly etched into his face. The city lights, a dazzling spectacle from the window, seemed to mock his fragility. It was Thorne Industries," he whispered, the name a reluctant confession. "A request, a suggestion." Julian felt a chilling wave of recognition. Thorne Industries, his father's legacy, a legacy built on ruthless ambition and questionable ethics. He'd always suspected his father's involvement in his infertility diagnosis, a convenient explanation for a man focused solely on the continuation of the Thorne line through legitimate means. His father's shadow, long banished, now loomed large and menacing. A suggestion to falsify medical records? Julian's voice was low, dangerously controlled. The anger was a coiled spring, ready to unleash. He thought of the twins, their soft skin, their innocent smiles, and the rage intensified. This wasn't just about him anymore. Albright nodded, his head bowed, shoulders slumped. They needed a heir, a legitimate one. He paused, his voice cracking. "Your father." He was very persuasive. The weight of the revelation settled heavily on Julian's chest, a crushing burden of inherited deceit. The sterile room felt smaller, the air thick with the unspoken history of his family. He saw not just the doctor's fear, but a reflection of his own past, his own vulnerabilities, his father's ruthless ambition mirrored in his own life. The babies, his babies, were not just a miracle. They were a symbol of rebellion against the cold, calculating world he'd inherited. This wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming his own future, forging a path separate from his father's shadowy legacy. He would break free from the chains of Thorne Industries and build a life where love, not power, would be the strongest force. The mahogany of Julian's study gleamed under the soft glow of a desk lamp, the only light breaking the oppressive darkness outside. Rain lashed against the window panes, mirroring the storm raging within him. He reread Albright's confession, the paper crinkling in his trembling hand. The words, "Thorne Industries, your father, very persuasive," burned into his retinas. He felt a physical ache, a deep, hollow space where years of carefully constructed denial had resided. Serafina entered, her silk robe a whisper against the silence. The scent of expensive perfume couldn't mask the tremor in her voice. "Julian? What is it?" He looked up, his eyes bloodshot, the weight of generations pressing down on him. They knew I could have children." The words were a choked whisper, a confession both to her and to himself. Serafina's face paled. She moved towards him, her hand reaching out tentatively. "But the doctor," he said. "He lied," Julian said, the bitterness sharp. "For my father. For Thorne Industries." The mahogany desk felt cold beneath his hand, a stark contrast to the sudden heat rising in his chest. He pushed himself away from it, the chair scraping harshly against the polished floor. The rain intensified, the sound a relentless percussion against the glass. He walked to the window, the city lights a blurred, chaotic tapestry below. He saw not power, but the fragility of human ambition. The lies, the manipulations, the calculated destruction of lives for the sake of a legacy. Serafina's hand rested on his arm, a gesture both hesitant and reassuring. "Your father," she began, her voice choked with unshed tears. "I never understood." He turned to her, the anger slowly fading, replaced by a profound weariness. "Neither did I," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion. "I built my life on his lies, on his cruel machinations. And now," he looked down at the confession, the words blurring, "now I have to rebuild it on truth." He looked at her, the pain in her eyes mirroring his own. The weight of the past, the lies, the manipulations. They were a shared burden now, a shared journey towards a truth neither of them could have ever anticipated. The babies, cradled in the nursery downstairs, were their future. A future carved from the ashes of the past. A future born of betrayal and forged in the crucible of truth. The rain continued to fall, relentless and unforgiving. But within the confines of that dimly lit study, a fragile hope began to take root. The sterile scent of antiseptic clung to the air in Dr. Albright's office, a stark contrast to the chaotic storm brewing inside Julian. He sat opposite the man, his once respected physician now a shadow of his former self, his eyes downcast, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his deceit. The mahogany desk between them felt like a chasm, a physical manifestation of the years of lies. "You knew," Julian's voice was low, controlled, but the tremor in his hands betrayed his inner turmoil. The faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner amplified the silence. He stared at the falsified medical records, the doctor's neat handwriting a mockery of the life it had stolen. Albright shifted uncomfortably. It wasn't intentional at first. It was a mistake, a misinterpretation, compounded by pressure. He swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. "Pressure," Julian repeated, his voice edged with icy fury. "From my father? From Thorne Industries?" Albright looked up, his gaze fleeting. "Your father, he was persuasive. He had considerable influence." His voice trailed off, defeated. The truth hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. Julian felt a surge of rage, a white-hot anger that threatened to consume him. Decades of his life, shaped by this lie, by his father's manipulative control, now felt like a grotesque parody of reality. The yearning for a child, the agonizing acceptance of his supposed infertility, all a cruel fabrication. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the polished floor, the sound jarring in the tense silence. He paced the small office, the sterile smell suddenly nauseating. He saw the fear in Albright's eyes, the regret etched into every line of his face. But Julian felt no pity. He'd spent years barren of what he now knew was his birthright. He stopped pacing, his eyes locking onto Albright's. "The twins," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet filled with raw emotion. "My sons. You stole years from me, years I'll never get back. Years with them." The weight of that loss, the stolen time, crashed down on him, the raw pain a physical blow. He saw the twins' faces in his mind's eye, their tiny hands, their innocent smiles, and the crushing weight of the past threatened to break him. Yet, in that moment of overwhelming sorrow, a spark of fierce determination ignited within him. He would reclaim those years, those stolen moments, and fight for a future built on truth, not on his father's manipulations and lies. The mahogany desk in Albright's office felt slick under Julian's trembling hand. The sterile scent of the room, usually a comfort in its clinical predictability, now felt suffocating. He stared at the falsified records, the elegant script a cruel mockery of his stolen years. Outside, the city hummed, a cacophony oblivious to the seismic shift in his life. "The Thorne family," Julian said, his voice a low growl, "has a history of discrepancies." He didn't need to elaborate. The unspoken weight of his father's ruthless ambition hung heavy in the air, a palpable presence in the small, hushed office. Albright flinched. "Your father, he was a formidable man. He insisted on certain outcomes." He wrung his hands, his expensive suit doing little to mask his agitation. The sweat beading on his forehead reflected the harsh overhead light. Julian stood, the movement jarring in the suffocating silence. He paced, the polished floor gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The anger, hot and raw, threatened to consume him. He saw his sons' faces in his mind, their tiny fists clenched, their eyes wide with a trust he'd almost lost the right to earn. "He used you," Julian said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "He used your reputation, your oath, to build his empire on a foundation of lies." The accusation hung in the air, a heavy, suffocating blanket. He stopped pacing, facing the doctor, his gaze intense. "And what about Serafina?" he asked, the question almost a whisper. The mention of his wife brought a fresh wave of pain, a bitter twist to the already agonizing truth. He saw her face, her cold, calculating expression, her carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of his newfound paternity. Her silence, her carefully veiled resentment, was a chilling counterpoint to the doctor's blatant guilt. The conspiracy extended beyond a single negligent doctor. It reached into the heart of his marriage, twisting the foundations of his life into a knot of lies and deceit. "She knew," Julian stated, more to himself than to Albright. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just about stolen years, but about stolen trust, stolen intimacy, stolen love. The depth of the betrayal threatened to overwhelm him. The faint ticking of a clock, the sterile scent of antiseptic, the doctor's trembling hands, all the elements of this sterile, clinical space combined to create a suffocating pressure, a prelude to a far more complex and dangerous confrontation. The battle ahead was not just against a corrupt doctor and a falsified past. It was a fight for his family, a fight for the truth, and a fight for his very soul. The city lights blurred through Julian's rain-streaked window. The hum of Manhattan, usually a comforting drone, felt invasive, a relentless reminder of the lies woven into the fabric of his life. He held the framed photo of his twins, their tiny hands clenched, a stark contrast to the cold steel of his penthouse. The scent of rain mingled with the expensive cologne he hadn't bothered to change since the revelation. "She knew," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. The bitter taste of betrayal was far worse than the sting of the medical deception. Serafina's silence, her calculated detachment, was a weapon sharper than any knife. He'd built an empire on precision, control, yet his own life felt like a chaotic storm. The mahogany of his desk felt cold beneath his fingertips as he reread Albright's confession, a meticulously detailed account of the conspiracy, implicating not only the doctor but a shadowy figure within the rival Beaumont family. The implications were staggering. The Beaumonts, his father's lifelong nemesis. The feud had spanned generations, a bitter inheritance passed down alongside wealth and power. A knock echoed through the opulent apartment, breaking the suffocating silence. His lawyer, sharp and efficient, stood in the doorway, his face etched with concern. The Beaumonts are reacting. They want a meeting. Julian felt a surge of cold dread. This wasn't just a matter of clearing his name. It was a war for his children's future. A war he never anticipated fighting. He stared at the photo again, the twins' innocent faces a beacon in the encroaching darkness. "Tell them I'll accept," he said, his voice low and steady, masking the tremor of fear that threatened to unravel him. The fight was on. The stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The mahogany gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the lawyer's office, a stark contrast to the plush comfort of Julian's penthouse. The air smelled faintly of old leather and expensive coffee, a scent that did little to soothe the turmoil churning within him. He sat across from Mr. Hayes, the lawyer's tailored suit a symbol of the controlled world he desperately craved to return to. But the image of his twins, their tiny fists clenched, haunted him. "They're prepared to negotiate, Mr. Thorne," Hayes said, his voice a low rumble. "But their terms, they're demanding." Julian steepled his fingers, the pressure a physical manifestation of the inner battle raging within him. The Beaumonts. The name itself felt like a cold weight in his chest, a legacy of bitterness stretching back generations. He'd always considered himself above such petty squabbles. Yet here he was, facing a war that threatened everything. "What do they want?" Julian asked, his voice tight. "A public retraction of your accusations, a significant financial settlement, and custody of the children." The words hit Julian like a physical blow. His breath hitched. Custody? The thought was unbearable. A violation so profound it threatened to shatter him completely. He thought of his sons, their soft skin, their innocent cries, and a fierce protectiveness flooded through him, a powerful emotion he hadn't known he possessed. He looked at Hayes, his eyes blazing. "They'll get nothing. Absolutely nothing." Hayes leaned forward, his expression grave. "Mr. Thorne, this isn't a game. They have the resources to drag this out indefinitely. The media, the public scrutiny." The lawyer's words were a grim reality check. Julian knew he couldn't afford a protracted legal battle. Not for himself, but for his sons. He had to fight, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. He closed his eyes, the image of Serafina's cold face flashing behind his eyelids. Her betrayal was a festering wound, a constant reminder of the fragility of his carefully constructed world. But the love for his sons, raw and powerful, overshadowed everything else. It was a force stronger than any betrayal, stronger even than the Beaumonts' wealth and influence. He opened his eyes, his gaze fixed on Hayes. "Find me a way to fight," Julian said, his voice low but firm. "I will not let them take my sons." The fight for his family, the fight for his future, had just begun. The city lights, visible through the office window, suddenly seemed less invasive, less a symbol of his lost control, and more a challenge, a silent testament to the battle ahead. The hushed tones of the Beaumont family lawyer, a man whose tailored suit seemed to exude an aura of cold calculation, grated on Julian's already frayed nerves. The mahogany conference table felt slick and cold beneath his fingertips, each grain a stark reminder of the opulent life he now risked losing. The scent of expensive cigars, usually a symbol of power and success, now felt cloying, suffocating. "Mr. Thorne," the lawyer began, his voice smooth yet edged with steel, "my clients are willing to compromise. However, their terms remain stringent. Julian's jaw tightened. He felt the familiar knot of anxiety constricting his chest, a feeling he'd successfully suppressed for years, only to be brutally confronted by the reality of his situation. He glanced at the file on the table, the crisp legal papers mocking the chaotic turmoil within him. The twins' tiny faces, captured in a recent photograph, stared back at him from a corner of the document, a painful reminder of the price of his fight. "And what are these stringent terms?" Julian asked, his voice low and controlled, betraying none of the fear that gnawed at him. He needed to appear strong, unyielding, for his sons. The lawyer cleared his throat. "The Beaumonts require a full and public apology, a significant financial settlement, and the relinquishing of your claim to the twins." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Relinquishing his claim? The thought was a physical blow, a searing pain that ripped through him. He closed his eyes, the image of his son's laughter, their soft touches, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile reality of the lawyer's office. He saw their tiny hands wrapped around his fingers, felt the unexpected warmth of their touch, the overwhelming love he never anticipated. He opened his eyes, his gaze unwavering. "They will get nothing," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "Absolutely nothing." The fury that blazed within him was a potent force, fueled by love and a primal need to protect his family. This was not just about business, it was about survival. The fight, he realized, had only just begun, and he would fight with every fiber of his being. The city outside, once a symbol of his power, now felt like a battlefield, and he was ready to wage war. The penthouse apartment, usually a sanctuary of polished marble and minimalist design, felt suffocating. Serafina paced, the click of her stilettos against the gleaming floor a relentless rhythm mirroring the turmoil within her. The city lights, a glittering tapestry spread below, offered no solace. She stopped, her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window a stranger, sharp, brittle, and utterly alone. "Julian's gone too far," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. The scent of lilies, her favorite, usually calmed her. Tonight, it only amplified the suffocating tension. She ran a hand through her meticulously styled hair, the gesture betraying the carefully constructed composure she'd maintained for so long. A knock echoed, followed by the soft murmur of the twins' nanny. Relief, a fragile thing, briefly eased the pressure in her chest. Yet, the sight of the babies, nestled in their cribs, only deepened her anxiety. Their innocent faces were a constant reminder of the precariousness of her carefully built world, a world built on lies and deceit. The phone buzzed, displaying an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered, her voice tight. "Yes," a low, gravelly voice responded. "The Beaumonts' offer remains. But time is running out, Serafina. Julian's stubbornness is costing you everything." The words were a chilling confirmation of her fears. She glanced at the sleeping infants, a wave of guilt washing over her. She justified her actions, convinced herself it was all for their security. But was it? Or was it simply to protect her own fragile sense of power and belonging in Julian's opulent world? The line crackled with silence before the voice continued, colder now. "Consider your position carefully. Julian will not always be able to protect you." The line went dead, leaving Serafina suspended between her fear and her desperate need to control the unraveling of her carefully spun web. She felt her resolve fraying at the edges. The choice was hers, and the stakes were far higher than she could ever have imagined. The city lights below seemed to mock her, their brilliance a cruel counterpoint to the darkness gathering within her. The mahogany doors of Julian's study, usually closed against the chaos of the outside world, stood ajar. Inside, the air hung heavy with the scent of old leather and unshed tears. Julian sat hunched over a desk littered with legal documents, the stark white paper a stark contrast to the turmoil in his eyes. The faint, rhythmic whirring of the city outside was a muted counterpoint to the frantic beating of his heart. He reread Serafina's hastily scribbled note. "Meet me, the rooftop garden. Midnight." The words felt like shards of glass, cutting through the carefully constructed composure he'd maintained. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture betraying the exhaustion etched onto his face. The twins' nursery, a haven of pastel colors and soft toys, felt impossibly distant. He rose, the floorboards groaning under his weight. Each step towards the rooftop garden felt like a step further into the unknown. The cool night air bit at his skin as he stepped onto the terrace. Serafina stood silhouetted against the city lights, her figure fragile yet defiant. I needed to talk, she began, her voice barely a whisper, lost in the vastness of the city. What is it, Serafina? His voice was rough, edged with a weariness that surprised even him. She turned, her face pale in the moonlight. The Beaumonts, they were behind the misdiagnosis. They wanted to discredit you, to take everything. Her voice cracked. It wasn't just about the hospital records. It was a calculated move. They knew about the twins. A cold dread tightened Julian's chest. He didn't need to ask why. The Beaumonts' ruthless ambition was legendary. And you knew. His voice was barely audible, a mixture of accusation and despair. Serafina's shoulders slumped. I tried to stop it. But, she hesitated, unable to meet his gaze. I was scared of losing everything. The city lights, usually a symbol of power and success, now felt like a cold, indifferent witness to their broken world. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, filled only with the distant sirens and the unspoken accusations hanging between them. He looked at her, truly saw her. Her mask of composure shattered, revealing the fear and vulnerability that had always lurked beneath the surface. He saw not a villain but a scared woman, desperately trying to protect herself and her children. A wave of compassion, unexpected and overwhelming, washed over him. The choice before him was no longer a simple matter of exposure or protection, but a more profound decision about forgiveness, reconciliation, and the fragile hope for a future that could emerge from the ashes of their broken past. The rooftop garden, usually a sanctuary of serene beauty, felt stark and unforgiving under the harsh glare of the city lights. Serafina's confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Julian felt the cold seep into his bones, mirroring the chill that had settled in his heart. The scent of night-blooming jasmine, usually so calming, was lost in the bitter tang of betrayal. He looked at Serafina, her face etched with a mixture of fear and regret. The moonlight cast long shadows, highlighting the tremor in her hands. He saw the woman he'd married, the woman he thought he knew, reduced to a fragile shell. "Why, Serafina?" he finally asked, his voice barely a whisper, the question a raw, exposed nerve. "They threatened everything," she choked out, her voice cracking. "They said they'd ruin you, take the twins, everything we'd built." She wrapped her arms around herself, as if warding off a physical blow. The silk of her gown felt flimsy against the raw wind. Julian closed his eyes, trying to reconcile the image of the ambitious, controlled woman he knew with the terrified creature before him. The weight of her fear pressed down on him, an unexpected burden. He ran a hand across his stubbled jaw, the rough texture a stark contrast to the smooth surface of her skin. "And you believe them?" he asked, his voice laced with a weary understanding. He wasn't angry, not yet. A dull ache settled in his chest, a deep, gnawing emptiness. "I panicked," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the city. I made a terrible mistake." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent testament to her despair. He stepped closer, the chill of the night air momentarily forgotten. He didn't reach out to touch her, not yet. He needed time, needed to process the avalanche of revelations that had shattered his world. He looked out at the cityscape, the sprawling expanse of concrete and steel, a stark reminder of the power and privilege that had been so easily threatened. And it wasn't just his wealth or position that was at stake. It was his family, his children. He needed to protect them from the Beaumonts and from the consequences of Serafina's choices. The battle was far from over. The penthouse suite, usually a symbol of their opulent life, felt suffocating. The scent of expensive lilies, normally a calming presence, now hung heavy, cloying. Julian stared at the city sprawling beneath them, a glittering tapestry of light and shadow that mirrored the turmoil within him. Serafina sat curled on the plush sofa, a fragile silhouette against the panoramic window. The silence stretched, thick and unbearable. He poured 2 glasses of brandy, the clinking ice a jarring sound in the quiet room. "They offered a deal," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the city. Her eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were now clouded with a desperate weariness. "To keep quiet, to protect us." He took a slow sip, the burn of the liquor a stark contrast to the icy dread that gripped him. "Protect us?" he repeated, his voice low and measured. "By lying to me? By concealing the existence of my own children?" She nodded, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. The diamonds on her finger glittered, cruelly mocking the fragility of her confession. "I was afraid," she confessed, her voice choked with emotion. "Afraid of losing everything. Afraid of your anger." Julian crossed the room, stopping before her. He saw the fear reflected in her eyes, not just fear of him, but a deeper, primal fear that went beyond the threat of the Beaumonts. It was the fear of losing the gilded cage she had so carefully constructed around them both. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing the strain he was battling. "And the twins?" he asked, his voice softer now, tinged with a raw sorrow. "You were afraid for them too?" "Yes," she whispered, her gaze locked on the carpet. They were my insurance, my security." Her voice cracked. "I am so sorry, Julian. I thought I was protecting you both." Everything was so terrifying. The weight of her confession settled upon him, heavy and crushing. He saw now, not just betrayal, but the desperation and insecurity that had fueled her actions. It didn't excuse her deceit, but it offered a glimpse into the complexities of her character. A character he thought he knew so well but clearly had not. The city lights shimmered below, a cold and indifferent witness to their unraveling. The decision he had to make, the path he was forced to choose, now felt even more agonizing. The mahogany desk felt cold beneath Julian's hands. The scent of old leather and expensive cigars, usually comforting, now felt suffocating. He stared at the meticulously organized files, each representing a piece of the shattered puzzle of his life. The city outside, a symphony of sirens and distant car horns, mirrored the chaos within him. He picked up a photograph, a younger, carefree Julian, laughing with a woman whose face was scratched out. The woman, the forgotten mother of his twins. Guilt, sharp and sudden, pierced him. Serafina entered, her footsteps quiet on the thick carpet. The diamonds on her hand flashed, a cruel reminder of the opulent lie they'd built together. "The Beaumonts want a meeting," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. The usual steel in her gaze was replaced by a haunted weariness. "And?" Julian asked, his voice barely a whisper. He hadn't slept properly in days, the exhaustion etched onto his face. She hesitated, running a hand through her perfectly styled hair, a gesture betraying her inner turmoil. They know. About the records, about everything." The admission hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Julian felt a chill crawl down his spine. He knew the Beaumonts, their ruthless ambition, their capacity for destruction. To them, this wasn't just a medical scandal. It was a war for power, for legacy, for the very soul of their empire. His empire. He stood, the chair scraping against the polished floor. And what did they propose? He needed to know, needed to understand the depth of the betrayal, the extent of the danger. Serafina's eyes filled with unshed tears. A deal, silence in exchange for their silence. Her voice cracked, the carefully constructed facade crumbling around her. "They want to bury it, Julian. Protect us." Profound. The crisp morning light, filtering through the nursery's gauzy curtains, illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. Julian watched Serafina, her usually sharp features softened by sleep-deprived exhaustion. She cradled Clara, humming a lullaby, a melody so quiet it was barely audible above the twins' gentle breaths. The scene felt fragile, precious. He approached cautiously, the weight of their unspoken resentments hanging heavy between them. The conspiracy, the betrayal, the years of carefully constructed lies. They loomed like a storm cloud, threatening to shatter this fragile peace. "She's peaceful," Serafina murmured, her eyes still fixed on her daughter. Her voice, husky with sleep, held a hint of something he hadn't heard in years. Vulnerability. "They both are," Julian replied softly, his gaze drifting to Leo, nestled in his bassinet. The scent of baby powder and milk hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile antiseptic he associated with his past. A silence settled between them, thick with unspoken words. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to somehow bridge the chasm that had separated them for so long. But the words seemed to catch in his throat. I didn't know," Serafina finally said, her voice barely a whisper. Her gaze flickered up to meet his, a flicker of something akin to regret in her eyes. "About the infertility." "Neither did I," Julian responded, the admission a raw confession of his own past deception. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers, hesitant. The fear of rejection was a palpable thing. She didn't pull away. Instead, she slowly turned her hand, her fingers intertwining with his. The touch was hesitant, uncertain, yet filled with a fragile hope. "It changes everything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their shared history, the shared lie, and the newly found truth. The quiet strength of her grip offered a surprising steadiness in the midst of this turmoil. The revelation of their twins, of his fertility, was the beginning, not the end. The path ahead was fraught with complexities, filled with mending the shattered pieces of their lives and confronting the looming conspiracy. But in that quiet nursery, bathed in the soft morning light, they found a tiny sliver of common ground, a shared responsibility, a fragile, precious hope. The air vibrated with unspoken apologies, a nascent understanding, a shared, tentative step towards reconciliation. The twins, Leo and Clara, gurgled contentedly in their adjacent bassinets. Sunlight streamed through the nursery window, painting dust motes in a golden dance. Julian watched them, a bittersweet ache blooming in his chest. The sterile perfection of his former life felt a lifetime away. He'd traded the polished surfaces of his penthouse for the chaotic sweetness of spilled milk and tiny, grasping hands. He picked up Leo, the baby's soft weight settling against his chest. The scent of baby powder and milk was strangely comforting, a stark contrast to the antiseptic smell that still clung to his memories of the hospital. He felt a wave of profound love, so intense it almost overwhelmed him. This wasn't the calculated, controlled affection he'd once imagined. This was raw, visceral, and utterly consuming. Serafina entered, her expression guarded. Yet, a flicker of something weariness, perhaps, or a hint of something akin to peace, softened her usually sharp features. She watched Julian cradling Leo, her gaze lingering on the scene. "They're remarkably alike," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. The tension between them still hung heavy, an unspoken acknowledgement of the betrayals and lies that had fractured their world. Julian nodded, his throat tight. Yes, identical. The word felt heavy, burdened by the weight of their shared secret. The paternity test, the shattered certainty of his infertility, the unraveling conspiracy. It all culminated in these two tiny humans. He looked at Serafina, truly seeing her for the first time in years. The strength he'd once admired, the ambition that had driven her, were overshadowed by an exhaustion that etched itself onto her face. He saw the vulnerability beneath the carefully constructed facade, the fear, the regret. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the chasm that still separated them, but he hesitated, the phantom ache of his past insecurities still lingering. He knew he had a long way to go to earn her trust. Yet, in the quiet of the nursery, Bathed in the soft morning light, a fragile hope began to take root. The path ahead was long, but he would walk it. For these children, for himself, and perhaps even for Serafina. The quiet hum of the city outside faded into the background, replaced by the soothing rhythm of their shared breathing. The future remained uncertain, but in this moment, surrounded by the innocent sleep of his twins, he felt a profound sense of peace. A quiet, nascent hope bloomed in the midst of the storm. The penthouse apartment, usually a sanctuary of sterile elegance, felt suffocating. Sunlight glinted off the polished marble floors, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the silent air, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy of the nursery downstairs. Julian sat at his desk, the mahogany cool beneath his fingertips. He traced the lines of a photograph. Leo and Clara, identical smiles mirroring each other. The image, a stark counterpoint to the carefully constructed facade of his life, tugged at something deep within him. He hadn't slept properly in weeks. The city's relentless hum, usually a backdrop to his ambition, now felt like a constant, irritating buzz. The weight of his deception, the betrayal of Serafina, the unraveling conspiracy, it all pressed down on him, a physical burden. A soft knock at the door. Serafina entered, her usual sharp edges softened by exhaustion. Dark circles underscored her eyes, a testament to sleepless nights mirroring his own. She carried a tray with 2 steaming mugs. "Coffee," she offered, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, accepting the mug. The warmth spread through his hands, a small comfort in the vast coldness of his emotions. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice husky. Silence hung between them, thick and heavy with unspoken words. The aroma of dark roast filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of her perfume, a familiar fragrance that once held allure, now tinged with the bitter taste of their shared secrets. Serafina met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the flickering city lights outside. I'm sorry," she finally said, the words catching in her throat. The admission, so unexpected, hung in the air, fragile and tentative as a newborn's cry. Julian looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time since the truth had shattered their world. He saw the remorse, the regret etched onto her face, replacing the mask of icy ambition. He saw the woman beneath the layers of deceit, a woman burdened by her own fears and insecurities. He reached across the desk, his hand covering hers. Her skin was cool, her fingers trembling slightly. He felt a surge of empathy, a profound understanding that transcended the anger and resentment that had festered between them. This wasn't about blame anymore. It was about healing. The road ahead was arduous, but for the first time, he felt a flicker of hope, a fragile seed of reconciliation taking root amidst the storm of their shattered lives. The sterile scent of antiseptic, usually a comforting constant, now felt suffocating. Julian cradled Leo, the baby's soft weight a surprisingly grounding force against the tremor in his hands. Clara, nestled in Serafina's arms across the room, gurgled contentedly. The nursery, once a symbol of their meticulously planned future, now felt like a battlefield where a fragile peace held sway. "He looks like you," Serafina said, her voice low, almost a sigh. She didn't meet his eyes. The admission, though simple, felt monumental. Julian looked down at Leo, his tiny fingers curled around a thumb. The resemblance was undeniable. The same strong jawline, the same dark, unruly hair already sprouting. A wave of protectiveness washed over him, so fierce it almost hurt. This tiny being, a symbol of his past mistakes and his present reckoning, was also his salvation. He shifted Leo gently, his movements careful and practiced. "And Clara resembles you," he replied, his voice equally soft. The words felt strange, foreign, like he was learning a new language, the language of fatherhood. He watched Serafina, the sharp angles of her face softened by exhaustion and a hint of something like regret. The icy exterior, the impenetrable wall of ambition, had begun to crack. The fear in her eyes, though still present, was tempered by something else, a flicker of vulnerability. A silence fell between them, punctuated only by Leo's contented sighs. The city's relentless pulse vibrated through the floor, a muted rhythm against the quiet intimacy of the room. The scent of baby powder mingled with the faint floral aroma of Serafina's perfume, a fragrance that had once been synonymous with his aspirations, now inextricably linked to his newfound reality. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. Her skin was cool, yet he felt a spark of connection, a bridge across the chasm of their unspoken resentments. The touch was brief, but profound. It was a silent acknowledgement of their shared responsibility, their intertwined destinies, and the path towards a future still shrouded in uncertainty, but not entirely devoid of hope. The weight of their past transgressions lingered, heavy and unavoidable, yet the tiny cries of their twins whispered a promise of forgiveness, of redemption, a new beginning. The following days were a blur of sleepless nights and hushed anxieties. The sterile hospital room, once a symbol of Julian's controlled life, now echoed with the chaotic symphony of twin cries. He learned the subtle nuances of their gurgles, the different pitches of their whimpers, each a tiny key unlocking a previously unknown part of his heart. He watched Serafina, her face etched with a weariness that belied her usual composure. The distance between them, once vast and impenetrable, seemed to shrink with each shared diaper change, each late-night feeding. One evening, the twins slept soundly, cradled in their bassinets. A shaft of late-afternoon sun slanted through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Julian sat beside Serafina, the silence between them filled only with the soft rhythm of their breaths. "I never knew," Serafina finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the city outside. How much I needed this." She looked at the sleeping twins, her expression a mixture of awe and trepidation. Julian reached for her hand, his touch tentative. "Neither did I," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "My whole life I built walls. I thought I was protecting myself, but I was only building a prison." He squeezed her hand gently, the warmth of her skin a stark contrast to the cold sterility of the room. The weight of their past mistakes hung heavy in the air, but it didn't crush them. Instead, it seemed to forge a new understanding between them, a fragile bond built on shared exhaustion, shared guilt, and a dawning realization that their love, though fractured, was not beyond repair. The twins, their tiny breaths a testament to their existence, were the mortar holding the fragments of their shattered lives together. The truth about the conspiracy remained a looming shadow, but for now, it was relegated to the background. In the quiet intimacy of that sunlit room, amidst the soft sighs of their sleeping children, Julian and Serafina found a measure of peace, a tentative step towards a future unknown, yet strangely hopeful. The scent of baby powder, a constant reminder of their new reality, now felt less sterile and more comforting. The sterile scent of antiseptic, once a constant, now felt less oppressive, muted by the sweeter aroma of baby powder and milk. Julian sat by the window, the city a hazy gray canvas beyond the glass. He cradled one of the twins, his small hand gripping Julian's finger with surprising strength. The weight of the past, the crushing burden of the conspiracy, felt momentarily lighter, replaced by the warmth of the tiny body nestled against him. He looked at Serafina, across the room, attempting to read the nuances of her expression. She was quietly assembling tiny clothes, her movements precise, yet her shoulders slumped with a weariness that tugged at Julian's heart. The coldness he'd once known was replaced by a fragile vulnerability. "He's looking at you," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the quiet hum of the room. Julian smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "He knows his mother." A flicker of something akin to gratitude touched her face, fleeting but undeniably present. The chasm between them wasn't bridged, not yet, but a crack had appeared, a pathway to something beyond the sterile walls of their past. Later, during a quiet moment while the twins slept, Julian spoke, his voice hesitant. "About the conspiracy." Serafina met his gaze, her eyes filled with a complex mix of fear and defiance. "It's not over, Julian. They know what we know. We're not safe. He took her hand, his touch firm but gentle. We'll face it together. This time we won't build walls. We'll face it together for them. He gestured towards the sleeping infants, their soft breaths the only sound in the room. A tear traced a path down Serafina's cheek. It wasn't a tear of grief, but of a profound relief, a recognition of the shared burden, the shared future. The truth hadn't healed everything, but it had given them a starting point, a foundation of shared responsibility, and a love that bloomed amidst the wreckage of their broken past. The silence that followed was not empty, but pregnant with unspoken promises, a silent acknowledgement of the difficult journey ahead, one they would walk hand in hand. The city lights twinkled outside, a silent witness to their fragile, newly born hope. The hushed intensity of the hospital room held a fragile peace. Sunlight, filtered through sheer curtains, cast a warm glow on the sleeping twins. Julian watched them, his heart aching with a love both fierce and tender. The scent of baby powder mingled with the faint antiseptic tang, a constant reminder of the sterile world he'd once inhabited. Serafina sat across the room, her usual sharp features softened by exhaustion. She cradled a worn photograph, her gaze distant. "They're beautiful," Julian murmured, his voice barely audible. He knew the words were inadequate, a feeble attempt to bridge the vast gulf that still separated them. Serafina nodded, her voice a low sigh. "Yes, beautiful and a constant reminder." The unspoken words hung in the air, a reminder of deceit, betrayal, and shattered trust. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant. "I know I hurt you, Serafina. I failed you, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make amends." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the vulnerability he'd fiercely guarded for so long. She didn't pull away, her fingers, surprisingly cold, intertwined with his. "The past, it can't be undone," she whispered, her gaze finally meeting his. A flicker of something akin to forgiveness, fragile as a newborn's breath, touched her eyes. "But perhaps we can build something new for them." She glanced towards the sleeping infants, her voice softening. Julian squeezed her hand, feeling a surge of hope, tentative but powerful. The weight of the conspiracy still loomed, a shadowy threat. But in the quiet sanctuary of the hospital room, surrounded by the soft breaths of their children, a new chapter began, a fragile dawn breaking through the long night of deception and denial. The fight wasn't over, but the battle had shifted. It was no longer a struggle for power or revenge, but a fight for a future built on truth, however painful, and a love born amidst the wreckage of their past. The city lights twinkled beyond the window, indifferent to their private struggle. Yet somehow, tonight, they seemed to shimmer with a muted hope. The following weeks were a blur of legal battles, hushed meetings, and the constant, comforting presence of the twins. The sterile scent of the hospital, initially a symbol of Julian's controlled life, now held the sweeter, softer aroma of baby powder and milk. He spent hours watching them, their tiny fingers grasping his, their innocent eyes mirroring a reflection of his own buried vulnerability. He found solace in the simplicity of their needs, a stark contrast to the complex web of deceit he was still untangling. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, Julian found Serafina in the nursery, her gaze fixed on the twins. The usual sharp lines around her mouth were softened, replaced by a weariness that tugged at his heart. The city lights glittered outside, painting the room in a soft, ethereal glow. "They're so much like you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The words, unexpected in their tenderness, hung in the air. He hesitated, the weight of their unspoken accusations pressing down. "And you?" he asked softly, his voice thick with emotion. He wanted to reach for her, to bridge the chasm that separated them, but the fear of rejection held him back. Serafina turned, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I was so afraid," she confessed, her voice cracking. "Afraid of losing everything, you, my position, everything I'd worked for." He walked towards her, the distance between them shrinking with each step. The cool marble floor felt cold under his feet, a stark contrast to the warmth he felt radiating from her. "I understand," he said, his voice laced with empathy. "I was just as afraid. Afraid of the truth. Afraid of what it would mean." He gently took her hand, his touch tentative yet reassuring. The cool smoothness of her skin against his sent a shiver down his spine. "But we've faced it," he continued, his voice gaining strength. "Together. And now we have something real. Something worth fighting for." The unspoken words hung between them, thick with the weight of their shared past and the fragile hope of their future. The city lights pulsed outside, indifferent to their private reconciliation. Yet tonight, they seemed to shine with a warmer, more compassionate light. The battle for power was fading, replaced by a silent, unwavering resolve to build a life, a family, based on truth and forgiveness. The lingering threat of the conspiracy still existed, a shadow that could not be fully erased. But in the quiet sanctuary of their nursery, surrounded by the soft breaths of their sleeping children, a new dawn was breaking. A dawn of hope, love, and a future yet to be written. The courtroom's sterile air hung heavy with the weight of unspoken accusations. Julian watched, his jaw tight, as the opposing lawyer, a sleek shark in a tailored suit, tore into Serafina's testimony. The fluorescent lights hummed, a jarring counterpoint to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. He felt the familiar chill of the marble floor beneath his shoes, a cold reminder of the icy distance that had grown between him and Serafina. Later, in the hushed sanctuary of their hospital suite, the twins slept soundly in their cribs, a soft symphony of gurgles and sighs filling the air. The scent of baby powder mingled with the faint antiseptic tang of the room. Julian sat beside Serafina, the space between them a chasm carved by months of suspicion and betrayal. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. I didn't know," Serafina whispered, her voice barely audible above the twins' breathing. Her eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were filled with a raw, unmasked vulnerability. Julian squeezed her hand, the cool smoothness of her skin strangely comforting. "I know." The words were simple, yet they held the weight of his forgiveness. He didn't need a detailed confession. He saw the remorse etched onto her face, the regret clouding her usually steely gaze. He understood her fear, her desperate need to protect the life they had built, even if it meant sacrificing the truth. He traced the delicate lines of her hand, the lines of worry and sleepless nights. The city lights, visible through the window, cast long shadows across the room. He saw the reflection of the city's relentless pulse in her eyes, a reflection of their own tumultuous journey. "We've been through hell," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion, "but we're still here." He looked at the sleeping twins, their faces serene in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. "And we have this." Serafina nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her body trembling slightly. The silence between them was no longer filled with accusation, but with a shared exhaustion, a shared grief, and the fragile beginning of healing. The battle was far from over, the legal ramifications still looming large, but in that quiet moment, surrounded by the soft sounds of their sleeping children, a fragile peace settled over them. A peace built not on denial or deceit, but on the hard-won understanding of shared vulnerability and the enduring strength of an unexpected love. The future remained uncertain, a tapestry yet to be woven, but the threads of hope, at last, were beginning to intertwine. The crisp morning light, filtered through the sheer curtains, painted the hospital room in a soft, ethereal glow. Julian watched the twins, Leo and Mia, their tiny fists clenched, their breaths shallow and even. A sense of fragile peace settled over him, a stark contrast to the turmoil of the past weeks. He felt the phantom weight of Serafina's absence. She had left for her parents' house, needing space, needing time. He picked up Leo, his small body warm against Julian's chest. The scent of baby powder and milk clung to him, a comforting aroma that now held the power to soothe Julian's frayed nerves. He hummed a wordless tune, a melody born of exhaustion and newfound love. This was his redemption, this quiet moment of profound connection. The phone rang, shattering the stillness. He flinched, the sharp sound jarring against the gentle rhythm of Leo's breathing. It was his lawyer, Mr. Davies. "Mr. Thorne." Davies' voice was crisp, businesslike. "The opposing counsel has agreed to a settlement. It's generous, generous." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The rival family, the de Veres, were retreating, but at what cost? He thought of the accusations, the betrayals, the lies that had been spun so expertly. He thought of Serafina, her face etched with worry, her eyes filled with a regret that mirrored his own. He held Leo closer, the tiny body a comforting weight against the turmoil within him. "What are the terms?" he asked, his voice rough. He knew the answer would carry weight, would shape the future he was so painstakingly trying to build. Davies outlined the agreement. A significant financial settlement, the withdrawal of all legal action, and a promise of confidentiality. Julian listened, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on him. He wasn't interested in retribution, not anymore. He needed peace, stability, a chance to build a real future with his children. He knew he wouldn't truly know if he could forgive Serafina, or even if she could forgive herself, until they faced the wreckage of their past together. This settlement was a first step, a fragile bridge across the chasm of their broken trust. "I accept," he said, his voice firm despite the trembling in his hands. He hung up, the silence returning, deeper, heavier this time. He looked down at Leo, at the soft curve of his cheek, the delicate flutter of his eyelashes. In that tiny, vulnerable life, he found a strength he hadn't known he possessed. A strength to forgive, to heal, to love. The sterile scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the chaos that had recently consumed Julian's life. The courtroom, despite its imposing grandeur, felt strangely small, confining. He watched as the de Vere lawyer, a sleek woman with a predatory smile, finalized the settlement. The words, though legally precise, felt hollow, a poor substitute for the truth. Julian felt a deep weariness, a bone-deep fatigue that went beyond simple exhaustion. He glanced at the empty seat beside him, a silent testament to Serafina's continued absence. Her silence was a heavy weight, mirroring the unspoken questions that echoed within him. Could their marriage survive this? Could he survive this? He squeezed his eyes shut, the image of the twins, Leo and Mia, their tiny faces crumpled in sleep, flashing before him. Their innocence, their vulnerability, were a stark reminder of the stakes. He'd risked everything, and in the end, what had he truly gained? Peace, yes, but at what cost? The lawyer's voice cut through his thoughts. The settlement includes full disclosure of falsified medical records, Mr. Thorne. The information will be released to the relevant authorities. Julian nodded, his throat constricting. Justice, cold and impersonal, was served, but it wouldn't fill the void left by the shattered trust. It wouldn't bring back the years lost in denial, or erase the pain etched onto Serafina's face. Outside the courthouse, the city thrummed with its usual relentless energy, a jarring contrast to the quiet turmoil within him. He inhaled the crisp autumn air. The scent of fallen leaves a poignant reminder of endings and new beginnings. He had chosen redemption over revenge, a path that was both liberating and terrifying. He looked up at the towering skyscrapers, each a testament to ambition, to the relentless pursuit of power. But now, he understood the emptiness that lay at the heart of such unchecked desires. He craved something else, something simpler. A quiet life, a loving family, a chance to build a future free from the suffocating weight of lies. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Julian felt a flicker of hope, a fragile flame in the vast darkness. The journey to rebuilding his life, his family, would be long and arduous, but he was finally ready to begin. The sterile hospital room felt colder than usual. The antiseptic sent a sharp counterpoint to the faint sweetness of baby powder clinging to Julian's clothes. He held Leo, the smaller twin, cradling the soft weight against his chest. The baby's rhythmic breathing was a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil within him. "He looks just like you," a quiet voice said. Serafina stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the pale light. Her face was still etched with a weariness that Julian recognized, a weariness mirroring his own. The cold distance that had separated them for weeks seemed to have softened, replaced by a fragile, tentative understanding. "Yes," Julian whispered, his gaze fixed on his son. The love he felt was overwhelming, a tidal wave crashing over his carefully constructed defenses. He'd spent years denying this primal connection, burying it beneath layers of ambition and control. Now it surged forth, raw and undeniable. Serafina stepped closer, her eyes lingering on the sleeping infant. A hesitant smile touched her lips. "Mia's stirring," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The tension in her shoulders seemed to ease slightly. He handed Leo to her, the transfer a silent acknowledgement of their shared responsibility, their shared burden. The silence between them was heavy, thick with unspoken words, with the ghosts of their past arguments and betrayals. But something had shifted. The weight of the conspiracy, the lies, the betrayals, they still loomed, but they no longer felt insurmountable. "We need to talk," Julian said, his voice husky with emotion. He wasn't sure what he would say, what he could even say, but the need to communicate, to begin the arduous process of rebuilding their fractured world, was overwhelming. The future remained uncertain, a tapestry woven with threads of hope and fear. But as he looked at Serafina, at the faint softening of her expression, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't dared to hope for. The possibility of forgiveness, of reconciliation. The faint scent of baby powder, a symbol of new beginnings, mingled with the antiseptic, a reminder that even in the sterile heart of a hospital, life, messy, complex, and beautiful, found a way to bloom. The city hummed outside, a muted symphony against the hushed tones of the hospital corridor. Julian, cradling Mia, felt the soft rise and fall of her chest against his palm. Her tiny fingers, curled around his own, tightened momentarily. He looked at Serafina, watching her interact with Leo. The sharp lines of her face, usually so meticulously sculpted, were softened by a weariness that mirrored his own. A faint blush, almost imperceptible, dusted her cheeks. "The investigation is moving forward," Julian said, his voice low, breaking the fragile silence. He shifted Mia, feeling the weight of her head against his shoulder. The scent of baby powder and antiseptic filled the air, a strangely comforting juxtaposition. Serafina nodded, her gaze fixed on Leo. "They're making progress." The cover-up was extensive, more widespread than we initially thought. A tremor ran through her voice, a subtle crack in her usual composure. He saw the fear lurking beneath the surface, the same fear that had driven her actions, the fear that had threatened to unravel everything. "I understand," he said, his voice rough with compassion. "We'll face it together." He offered her a gentle smile, a gesture of reassurance more than a statement. The weight of the conspiracy still pressed upon them, but it felt different now, less like a crushing burden and more like a shared challenge. The twins, nestled between them, represented more than just a biological miracle. They were a bridge, a fragile link connecting him and Serafina across the chasm of their past. The silence stretched, filled only with the soft sounds of their breathing, the distant hum of the city, the quiet hope of a new beginning. The sterile environment, once a symbol of his controlled life, now felt like a haven, a space for healing and reconciliation. He saw a flicker of something in Serafina's eyes, not quite forgiveness, but the tentative beginnings of trust. The road ahead would still be long and arduous, but for the first time in a long time, Julian felt a sense of cautious optimism, a glimmer of hope in the midst of the aftermath. The sterile scent of disinfectant clung to the air, a stark contrast to the warmth radiating from Julian as he held Mia close. Sunlight, filtering through the tall hospital windows, illuminated dust motes dancing in the stillness. He watched Serafina, her usual icy composure replaced by a fragile vulnerability. Leo gurgled contentedly in her arms, a tiny, insistent counterpoint to the quiet hum of the city outside. "The arrests were swift," Serafina said, her voice barely a whisper, breaking the silence. Her eyes, usually sharp and calculating, held a haunted quality. The evidence was overwhelming. Julian nodded, his gaze lingering on his daughter's peaceful face. "Justice served," he murmured, the words feeling both hollow and profoundly satisfying. The weight of the conspiracy, the betrayal, the fear, they still lingered, a ghostly presence in the room. But the sharp edges were softened, dulled by the miracle of his twins. He felt the profound shift within himself. He looked at Serafina again, noticing the subtle tremor in her hand as she adjusted Leo's blanket. The years of carefully constructed walls between them seemed to crumble further with each passing moment. The coldness that once defined their relationship was melting, revealing a raw and vulnerable undercurrent. "It's over, Serafina," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "We can begin to heal." She met his gaze, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Begin?" she echoed, a faint smile playing on her lips. "We've already begun, haven't we?" The smile widened, a genuine, unforced expression that illuminated her face. The fear hadn't vanished completely, but it was overshadowed by something stronger, a dawning hope. The babies, their tiny breaths filling the air with life, were the embodiment of that hope. A future, uncertain yet promising, lay before them, built not on deception and power, but on the fragile, precious foundation of love and truth. The sterile hospital room, once a symbol of his controlled life, now felt like a sanctuary, a space where they could rebuild their world. The days that followed were a blur of soft skin, milky smells, and the constant, soothing rhythm of twin breaths. Julian, surprisingly adept at the art of burping a baby, found himself utterly captivated. He watched, mesmerized, as Leo's tiny hand grasped his finger, a connection stronger than any boardroom deal. Mia, ever watchful, mirrored her brother's quiet contentment. The sterile hospital room, once a symbol of his carefully constructed life, now felt infused with a chaotic, beautiful warmth. "They're remarkable," Serafina murmured one evening, cradling Mia. Her voice, though still reserved, held a note of wonder Julian hadn't heard before. The icy facade was cracking, revealing glimpses of the woman beneath. He watched her, a question unsaid hanging between them. The weight of their shared secret, the unraveling conspiracy, still pressed down, but the twins were a vibrant counterpoint, a testament to life's unpredictable resilience. He reached out, his touch tentative as he brushed a stray strand of hair from Mia's forehead. "Yes," he agreed softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Remarkable." The word felt inadequate, a pale reflection of the overwhelming love surging through him. He looked at Serafina, the subtle shift in her expression, a flicker of something akin to affection, a small, fragile victory amidst the ruins of their broken trust. The hospital room, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for them to rebuild, to forgive, to choose love amidst the wreckage of their carefully constructed lives. The future remained uncertain, a canvas yet unpainted, but the vibrant colors of his children's lives were already beginning to fill the frame. The scent of baby powder mingled with the faint antiseptic smell, a new fragrance for a new beginning. The sterile scent of antiseptic still clung to Julian's clothes, a lingering reminder of the hospital. He sat in his penthouse apartment, overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline, a stark contrast to the tiny hands that now held his heart captive. Leo, gurgling happily, kicked his legs in the air, while Mia, eyes wide and curious, studied a brightly colored mobile. The twins were a constant whirlwind of activity, a vibrant counterpoint to the quiet tension that still hung between him and Serafina. "They're exhausting," Serafina said, her voice soft, almost a whisper, as she gently rocked Mia. The words were factual, not a complaint. Julian saw a flicker of something akin to tenderness in her eyes, a fragile blossom pushing through the hardened ground of resentment. "Exhausting and wonderful," Julian corrected, a smile playing on his lips. He watched her, the carefully constructed armor around her heart beginning to crack. He felt a surge of hope, a fragile promise of healing. The past few weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions: guilt, fear, overwhelming love, and a tentative acceptance of the unforeseen future. The legal battle was ongoing. The investigation into the conspiracy was proceeding slowly, but surely. "The lawyers called again," Serafina said, breaking the silence. The quiet strength in her voice gave way to weariness. "They want me to cooperate fully." Julian nodded, understanding the implication. Cooperating meant revealing more of her own tangled web of deceit, her own role in the long-ago cover-up. The weight of it pressed upon them both, a silent burden shared. He reached out, his hand gently covering hers. The touch was tentative, cautious, but full of unspoken promises. Their silence held more than words ever could, a tapestry woven with regret, hope, and a tentative, hard-won affection. He felt the subtle shift in her expression again, a fleeting moment of vulnerability before her defenses rose once more. He understood the slow, agonizing process of healing. They were far from the end, yet the journey was finally beginning. The twins, oblivious to their parents' internal turmoil, continued to gurgle and coo, their innocent laughter a soothing balm to the wounds of the past. The future, though uncertain, seemed to hold the promise of a brighter dawn. The morning sun, a pale gold filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of their penthouse, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. Julian watched Leo crawl, his tiny hands gripping the plush rug, a determined furrow in his brow. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint sweetness of baby powder, a stark contrast to the bitter taste of the past few weeks. "He's relentless," Serafina murmured, her voice barely audible above the soft gurgles emanating from Mia's crib. She watched Leo with a strange mixture of detachment and fascination, her eyes betraying a flicker of something that resembled tenderness. "Like his father," Julian replied, a soft smile playing on his lips. He felt a pang of guilt, the memory of his own distant father a sharp contrast to the overwhelming paternal love he now felt for these tiny humans. He had been a stranger to them, but in his transformation, they had become anchors in his life. Later, in the muted light of their lavish bedroom, Serafina confessed, her voice trembling. "The lawyers want a full confession. Everything." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Her hand, resting on the crisp white sheets, trembled slightly. Julian reached across the bed, his touch tentative. "We face it together," he whispered, his voice firm despite the tremor in his heart. The weight of the conspiracy, the betrayal, the lies, they all hung between them, a palpable tension in the otherwise luxurious surroundings. He saw a tear escape from the corner of her eye, and he felt a surge of sympathy, a feeling that had been alien to him only a few months earlier. The distance between them had begun to shrink, replaced by a shared burden, a shared understanding of the difficult road ahead. The sterile scent of the hospital was fading, replaced by the gentler aroma of hope and shared vulnerability. The twins' laughter, drifting in from the next room, felt like a promise of a future built not on deception, but on truth. The future was unclear, but the journey, for the first time, felt shared. The twins, Leo and Mia, were a whirlwind of tiny fists and gurgling laughter, a stark contrast to the hushed, sterile environment of their previous weeks. Julian, perched on the plush rug of their penthouse playroom, watched them with a tenderness that surprised even himself. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the golden beams. He felt a profound sense of peace he hadn't known existed, a quiet joy that hummed beneath his skin. "They're exhausting," Serafina said, her voice laced with a weariness that belied her usual composure. She sat on a low velvet chaise lounge, a half-empty cup of tea forgotten beside her. Yet her gaze, though tired, lingered on the children. There was a hesitant softness in her eyes that Julian found both captivating and unsettling. "Exhausting, yes," he agreed, his voice soft, but worth every moment. He reached out, gently cupping Leo's tiny hand, the warmth of the baby's skin shockingly intense against his own. The memory of the cold, impersonal sterility of the hospital felt like a lifetime ago. Worth it, Serafina repeated, a hint of bitterness coloring the words. Or necessary damage control? Her question hung in the air, thick and heavy with unspoken accusations. The delicate balance they'd painstakingly constructed over the past few weeks teetered precariously. Julian didn't respond immediately. He knew the undercurrents of her words. The fear of exposure, the lingering resentment, the uncertainties of their future. He stood, picking up a fallen wooden block, the smooth texture grounding him. "We'll face it together," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Whatever it is." He walked towards her, the sunlight catching the silver in his hair. The distance between them, once a chasm of unspoken resentments, felt smaller now, bridged by a shared experience, a mutual vulnerability. He reached out and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her forehead, his touch tentative but undeniably affectionate. The scent of her perfume, a familiar blend of jasmine and sandalwood, filled his senses. This time, it wasn't a symbol of distance and formality, but a shared intimacy. The future remained uncertain, but the journey, once lonely and terrifying, now felt, for the first time, truly shared. The city hummed outside their penthouse windows, a muted symphony of sirens and distant traffic, a stark contrast to the quiet intensity within. Serafina stirred, the jasmine scent of her perfume a faint whisper in the air. Julian watched her, the lines of worry etched around her eyes a poignant reminder of the tumultuous journey they'd shared. He sat beside her, the plush velvet of the chaise sinking gently under his weight. "The article is out," he said, his voice low, the words hanging between them like a fragile, unspoken threat. Serafina's hand tightened around her teacup, the delicate china trembling slightly. "And?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. She didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on the swirling tea leaves. "It mentions the hospital, the cover-up, but nothing directly implicates us." He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant but reassuring. The cool smoothness of her skin contrasted sharply with the warmth of his own. A tense silence stretched between them, filled only with the soft murmur of the city and the faint sounds of Leo and Mia's playful babbling from the next room. The twins, their existence a constant reminder of the upheaval that had shattered their lives, were also the fragile glue attempting to hold them together. "It won't stay quiet," Serafina finally said, her voice laced with a quiet fear. "They'll dig deeper." She looked at him then, her eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and a desperate plea. Julian squeezed her hand, a silent promise of support passing between them. "We'll face it together," he repeated, the words carrying a weight of conviction this time, a quiet strength born of shared adversity. He leaned closer, his gaze soft, searching. This isn't the end. It's a new beginning. For us, for them." He gestured towards the next room, his voice softening with the mention of their children. The fear remained in Serafina's eyes, but something else flickered there too. A tentative hope, a glimmer of trust rekindling in the ashes of their shattered past. The battle wasn't over, far from it. But in that shared moment of vulnerability, a new understanding began to bloom. A fragile shoot pushing through the hard earth of deceit and betrayal, promising the possibility of a future built on truth and, perhaps, forgiveness. The mahogany desk gleamed under the soft glow of the desk lamp, its polished surface reflecting Julian's weary face. He reread the article, the crisp newsprint crinkling in his hands. The city's hushed condemnation was a palpable presence in the penthouse suite. He felt the weight of it, a physical pressure on his chest. Serafina entered, the scent of lilies her favorite, barely masking the undercurrent of anxiety. She moved with a brittle grace, her usually sharp edges softened by exhaustion. "They're digging," she whispered, her voice catching. She ran a hand through her hair, the gesture revealing the strain beneath her composed exterior. Julian nodded, his gaze fixed on the article. They'll find nothing concrete linking us directly. But the implication, the shadow, it's enough. She sat opposite him, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. The twins, usually a source of chaotic joy, slept soundly in the next room. Their peaceful breaths were a stark counterpoint to the storm raging within their parents. "This changes everything," Serafina said, her voice barely audible. "Everything we built, our reputation, our—" She trailed off, unable to utter the word future. Julian reached across the desk, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was electric, a jolt of understanding passing between them. "It doesn't have to," he said, his voice low and steady. "We faced worse. We survived it. We'll face this too together." His gaze held hers, a silent promise echoing in his eyes. He saw a flicker of the old Serafina there, defiant, intelligent, strong. A sliver of hope. He stood, pulling her up with him. He embraced her gently, the scent of lilies mingling with her perfume. A familiar comfort in this unfamiliar landscape of fear and uncertainty. He felt the tremor in her body, the fragility beneath her carefully constructed facade. And for the first time since the shattering revelation, he felt a stirring of real hope, not just for their future, but for the redemption of their past. The battle was far from over, but hand in hand, they would face it. The city's relentless hum faded as Julian and Serafina stepped onto their sun-drenched terrace. The scent of jasmine, thick and sweet, momentarily eclipsed the lingering bitterness of recent events. Below, Central Park spread like a green tapestry, a calming balm against the turmoil within. He poured 2 glasses of chilled Chardonnay, the clinking crystal a fragile counterpoint to the gravity of their situation. "It's quiet," Serafina murmured, her gaze lost in the distant cityscape. Her voice, usually sharp and commanding, held a fragile tremor. The carefully constructed mask of composure had slipped, revealing the exhaustion etched beneath. Julian watched her, his heart aching. The Serafina he knew, the woman who had once seemed so fiercely independent, was diminished, vulnerable. The weight of their shared secret, the public scrutiny, had worn her down. "It will be," he said softly, handing her a glass. "We'll weather this." She took the glass, her fingers brushing his. The contact, once a spark of unspoken desire, now felt like a fragile lifeline. "Do you believe that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Doubt, raw and unsettling, clouded her usually bright eyes. He met her gaze, his own reflecting the uncertainty that mirrored hers. "I have to," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his heart. "For them." He gestured towards the open window where the faint sounds of their twins' laughter drifted in. The innocent joy of their children was a constant reminder of what they were fighting for. The tiny echoes were a beacon of hope in the stormy sea of their scandal. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a breathtaking spectacle that felt ironically detached from their immediate reality. The beauty was a stark contrast to the ugliness of their situation, a reminder of the peace they hoped to reclaim. The Chardonnay, once a symbol of celebration, now served as a silent toast to their resilience, to the uncertain future that lay before them, and to the fragile hope of a new beginning. The penthouse suite, usually a sanctuary of cool minimalism, felt suffocating. Sunlight, usually welcomed, now seemed to highlight the dust motes dancing in the oppressive silence. Julian paced, the polished marble floor cold beneath his bare feet. Serafina sat rigidly on the sofa, the expensive silk cushions doing little to soften her sharp angles. The twins, usually a source of chaotic joy, slept soundly in their cribs, their peaceful breathing a stark contrast to the storm raging between their parents. "We need to talk," Julian said, his voice rough. He stopped pacing, forcing himself to meet her gaze. The usual steel in her eyes was dulled, replaced by a weary exhaustion that mirrored his own. Serafina didn't respond, her gaze fixed on a point beyond the panoramic city view. The weight of their shared secret, the relentless media scrutiny, had etched lines of worry around her eyes, transforming her from the icy queen Julian had married into a haunted woman. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant wail of a siren. About the future, Julian continued, choosing his words carefully. The fear that shadowed his own heart was a palpable thing. The possibility of losing her, of losing the fragile family they had salvaged from the wreckage of lies and deceit, felt like a physical blow. "There isn't one," Serafina finally said, her voice barely a whisper, each word a shard of ice. "Not anymore." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, lost in the creamy expanse of her skin. He moved towards her, the cool marble no longer a barrier but a stark reminder of the distance that had grown between them. He knelt beside her, the scent of her expensive perfume, usually alluring, now heavy with unspoken sorrow. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers, the contact fragile and hesitant. "There has to be," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "For the children, for us." His voice faltered. The hope that had sustained him through the darkest days threatened to extinguish itself in the face of her implacable despair. The weight of their shared history, the betrayals, the lies, felt insurmountable. He looked down at her hand, then into her eyes, a silent plea. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and red. The city lights twinkled, a million tiny sparks in the encroaching darkness. Outside, the city's relentless hum continued, a constant reminder of the world beyond their private turmoil. But in that moment, all that mattered was the two of them, two souls battered by adversity, clinging to the hope of a future they were yet to define. The silence hung heavy between them, a promise of an unspoken conversation that would determine the fate of their fragile family. The city hummed a low, persistent thrum outside the penthouse's floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside, a fragile peace settled. The twins, nestled in their cribs, slept soundly, their tiny breaths barely disturbing the stillness. Serafina, curled on the sofa, looked smaller, more vulnerable than Julian had ever seen her. The sharp angles of her usual composure were softened by exhaustion, replaced by a haunting fragility. He sat beside her, the cool silk of the sofa a stark contrast to the warmth radiating from her. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, but she didn't pull away. Her fingers, usually so meticulously manicured, were slightly chapped, a testament to the sleepless nights. "I know what you're thinking," Julian said softly, his voice a low rumble against the quiet. He squeezed her hand gently. "About leaving, about starting over." Serafina didn't speak, but a single tear escaped, tracing a path through the faint dusting of powder on her cheek. The city lights glittered like scattered diamonds beyond the window, a breathtaking spectacle, yet it failed to distract from the raw emotion in her eyes. "It's not that simple," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "It's everything. The lies, the betrayal. It's a part of me now." He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. The scandal had shattered their lives, exposing the underbelly of their privileged world. But amidst the wreckage, a new foundation was being laid, brick by agonizing brick. "We can rebuild," Julian said, his voice laced with quiet strength. "Together, or apart. But we need to choose. For us, and most importantly, for them." He gestured towards the sleeping twins. Their existence, a testament to their shared history, demanded a decision. Serafina looked at the babies, her expression softening. A flicker of hope, faint but present, appeared in her eyes. The city lights continued to blaze, their vibrant glow casting a warm light on the scene, hinting at the possibility of a shared future, reborn from the ashes of the past. The silence held a new quality, no longer filled with despair, but with the quiet weight of unspoken possibilities. A new chapter, yet unwritten, lay before them. The crisp autumn air, scented with wood smoke and damp leaves, seeped through the open window of Julian's study. He sat at his massive mahogany desk, the city sprawling beneath him like a glittering tapestry, but his gaze remained fixed on the framed sonogram, the twins' tiny forms a stark contrast to the imposing cityscape. He'd spent the last few weeks immersed in rebuilding, not just his reputation, but his soul. Serafina entered, her footsteps soft on the plush carpet. The fragility he'd seen that night was gone, replaced by a quiet strength that surprised him. She held a small, worn book, its pages yellowed with age. "I found this," she said, her voice low, "in the attic. My grandmother's journal." He took the book, his fingers tracing the faded lettering on the cover. The weight of the past, the lies, the betrayals, felt less heavy now, less suffocating. He opened the book, the paper brittle under his touch. It was a story of hidden love, of sacrifices made, a story surprisingly parallel to their own. "She was pregnant at 16, Serafina said, sitting beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. "Married off, told to forget her dreams." The faintest tremor ran through her hand. Julian looked at her, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, no longer mirroring the cold, calculating woman he'd married, but a woman bearing the scars of her own silent battles. "And she never forgot," he whispered, his voice thick with understanding. The shared silence held a newfound intimacy, a bond forged not only in shared adversity, but in a shared understanding of the painful sacrifices and unforeseen strength that lie dormant within. The journal became a common ground, a shared exploration of their intertwined histories, their individual journeys, converging in the present moment, illuminated by the soft glow of the city lights and the warmth of their nascent forgiveness. The city outside, once a symbol of ambition and betrayal, now felt like a witness to their fragile but growing reconciliation. Their future remained unwritten, but it held the promise of a new beginning, shared not just as husband and wife, but as allies in the face of adversity. The twins' gentle breathing from the next room served as a gentle reminder of the innocent lives entrusted to their care and the responsibility they now held, to nurture hope amidst the wreckage. The mahogany crib, a miniature replica of Julian's imposing desk, held one of the twins, Leo, fast asleep. Sunlight, filtering through the sheer curtains, painted dust motes dancing in the air. A gentle breeze carried the scent of lilacs from Central Park, a stark contrast to the sterile hospital scent that had clung to them for weeks. Julian watched him, a lump forming in his throat. The raw, untamed power he'd wielded in the boardroom felt insignificant compared to the delicate curve of his son's cheek. Serafina entered, her footsteps silent. She carried a steaming mug, the aroma of chamomile tea filling the room. "He's beautiful," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. The bitterness that had hardened her features seemed to have softened, replaced by a tentative vulnerability. "They both are," Julian whispered, his gaze lingering on Leo's peaceful face. The weight of his past actions, the lies and betrayals, pressed down on him. He looked at Serafina, her eyes reflecting the muted sunlight. I'm sorry," he began, the words catching in his throat. The apology wasn't just for the lies, but for the emotional distance he'd kept. Serafina's hand brushed his arm, a light touch that spoke volumes. "I am too," she replied, her voice barely a breath. "For building walls, for prioritizing ambition over everything else." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. The warmth of her skin, the unspoken understanding that passed between them, felt like a fragile bridge across the chasm they'd created. The city outside, once a symbol of his power and ambition, now felt like a distant hum, its noise muted by the quiet intimacy of the moment. The future was still uncertain, but the possibility of rebuilding, of finding peace within the wreckage, felt tangible. The twins' quiet breathing, the scent of lilacs, and Serafina's hand in his, these were the anchors grounding him in the present, offering a glimpse of a new beginning. The past wouldn't be erased, but it could be understood, forgiven, even integrated into the fabric of their newly evolving lives. Weeks later, the penthouse apartment hummed with a different energy. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden light. The once sterile space now echoed with the cheerful babble of twins, Leo and Mia, their laughter a counterpoint to the city's low thrum. Julian, cradling Mia, felt a warmth spread through him, a stark contrast to the icy chill that had once defined his existence. He looked at Serafina, across the room, gently rocking Leo. The bitterness had truly leached from her face, replaced by a quiet contentment that mirrored his own. "Remember the hospital?" he asked, his voice soft. Serafina smiled faintly, a ghost of the icy woman he once knew. Every sterile detail, the fear. She trailed off, her eyes welling. But now, the scent of baby powder overpowers everything else. He nodded, his gaze lingering on Mia's tiny fingers curled around his. The weight of the conspiracy, the betrayals, still pressed upon him, but the burden felt lighter, shared. Justice had been served, not with vengeful retribution, but with quiet, meticulous dismantling of the network of deceit. The rival family, stripped of their ill-gotten gains, faded into obscurity. That evening, they sat on the terrace, the city lights a twinkling backdrop to their quiet intimacy. A gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine and night blooming cereus. Julian watched Serafina, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the moon, and understood. Their bond, forged in the crucible of betrayal and revelation, was stronger, more resilient than he'd ever believed possible. The future was uncertain, yes, but it was theirs to build, together. Hand in hand, they looked out at the city, a new dawn breaking over the horizon, mirroring the dawn of a new chapter in their lives, a life filled with the sweet, chaotic symphony of twin babies' laughter. The past, though indelible, was no longer their master. The future, though uncertain, was theirs to claim.